Hello, my name is Meredith Kutz, the Professional Development Associate here at NACE. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Successful Engagement of Native American Students. It is my pleasure to introduce Luis Amaro, Head of University Partnerships and Veteran Initiatives for M3. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Luis Amaro, Head of University Partnerships for M3. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm very, very excited to be part of this panel discussion and more so to be able to share some insights with some very, very great guests who have been very gracious to share their time with us today. I'll just introduce some of our panelists and we'll get going with our panel conversation today. First up, we have Tamison Smith. She is the Associate Director of Career Development and Outreach for St. Cloud State University. Also on today's panel, we have Jack Soto, the Senior Program Manager for Career Readiness and Employment at American Indian College Fund. We also have Angel Moniz, who's a student at the United Tribes Technical College. I think the format for today is going to be very straightforward. What we're going to do is we're really just going to treat this as an informal conversation with the goal that we can share some insights. And if anything, you're able to take away one thing as a participant that's going to help bridge the gap, both for employer engagement, student engagement, as well as university engagement. What I will do now is really just dive into the questions. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. We do have somebody actively monitoring them, and we will more than likely come back at the end of the presentation to really answer some of the questions and go over any feedback that you may have as a participant. The first question today is actually, I'm going to put this out to Jack first. Really, it's around, what do you feel, can you actually describe the Native American student views for success, as well as what other resources and barriers that they may have in successfully engaging with employers, Jack?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. And I want to acknowledge the lands that you all are on in your various locations, and want to invite just a little bit of the knowledge and the wisdom of the elders who have gone before us and sort of coming together to sort of do some of this work today. A great question. I think that, you know, the American Indian College Fund has sort of taken us on as one of our primary challenges in figuring out, like, how do we work with our students who are, you know, unique in a variety of different facets of access, and also just sort of information that they're sort of seeking. You know, I call it curiosity, and I also, you know, established this idea of confidence. I did want to share something that I think would be useful for just sort of leading and guiding some of this. So, and this is a resource that I can present to you if you want in a more intimate setting to sort of get a better idea of like what I'm talking about when you see this image. So let me go ahead and bring it up. So we have been working with students for a number of years, and I've been working in higher ed for a little bit longer than that. And what I've taken away from the idea, from the ideas and the input of students, is that most of the ideas that they are generating around employment are driven by this idea of competition, which seems to be a very, like it's a associated mechanism for just sort of thinking about planning and curiosity. So what we found is that reciprocity seems to be the central, point of entry in reference to thinking about where they show up as people, but that idea of reciprocity does not translate into a conversation about employment and thinking more critically about the long-term future. So in that, I've carved out these 4 spaces: ways of being, storytelling, relationality, and ways of knowing. Giving them some really good structural spaces, and thinking about ways of being is just sort of like self-awareness. Storytelling is like writing a story based upon what you know about yourself, and then thinking about how do you turn that into where you want to go, and acknowledging the skill sets that you're sort of providing. And then relationality is sort of like, how do I show up in the world to drive this idea of like what I need to know and what I know about myself, and then getting to the point of just sort of sharing that identity structure. But at the core of this is basically like they're driven by their values. They have a high sense of service, and they want to be able to figure out like, how do I do what I want to do in ways that can be helpful to their community. And I think that, I'm going to look to Angel to provide a little bit more of insight as a student, but, we know that this is something that is really crucial to the way that we're developing and conceptualizing more of our I guess, our idea around thinking about working with the students and thinking about the long-term trajectory, because there's a lot of barriers that we find, and I put that into the medicine wheel for a specific reason, because we know that students, when they enter college, Native students specifically, and go through a variety of challenges, and through those challenges, they learn how to, let go of things, and what I've called little deaths. And in that, it's sort of like they have to come to the ending of something to get to the new thing. And so they're always sort of transitioning and moving through, letting go, and then re-identifying or reinvigorating or regenerating the limb that they probably just cut off. So I'm going to stop there and then look to Angel to add some depth.
Thank you, Jack. So Angel, if you could just share from a perspective of a student, what do you think you have to add to that? I think that the most important thing for today is really just taking this opportunity to listen and educate ourselves, really, of just taking something away. And I think your perspective, Angel, is going to be very useful right now.
Tashkanito sha mapago goga miha enitos nuitaros militaris arikiraros wano takashini tokani wahuros. I just greeted you in my traditional language, which is Nuita. And I do that as a way to hold myself accountable and also recognize those who came before me. And so, I guess to touch on that a little bit, so I'll just go ahead and translate a little bit. What have I said? I said, hello, my name is Butterfly Woman. I am Nuita Heraza and Sanish from the MHA Nation, and I've come today in a good way. So I think most importantly, something to keep in mind is actually being an Indigenous student and actually getting to college is a huge success within itself. We have many barriers to overcome, educationally, economically, and so on and so forth. So for us to get to that place where we're able to attend college is a huge success. And it's important to keep that in mind. I guess I would like to say that everything that we do has been instilled. It's been instilled in us at a very, very young age to think of our relatives, of our community, of our connection to the land. These are things that are ingrained in us at a very young age. So I relate with what Jack said, is how we're continuously transitioning and continuously moving. That's a barrier after barrier to continue to move in that cycle. So I think without going on too long, I think that's kind of what I would like to share to that.
That's a very, very powerful statement, Angel. Thank you very, very much. It'd be great to get some feedback from Tamison regarding this. Really would love to hear from the school side what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think what Angel said, just to add on to that, often, myself as a Native student, you're not aware of many of these because, like Angel said, they're ingrained in you for so long that you're not always aware of the conflicts and the barriers that you're running into. So the things that Jack had on the wheel, the fact that some of the things that were on there and the conflicts that those create for students between the ways that they were raised and then the ways that dominant culture is, those conflicts, you don't even understand them. You just keep bumping into them. And Angel, maybe you can just nod if you understand what I'm saying. You just keep bumping into them, but you're like, I don't understand why I keep bumping into this, why it's not working for me. And so students may not understand them, but they keep bumping into them. And so I think what I really like about what Jack's doing, and then maybe what, for example, some of the things that I've tried to do with maybe what NACE has put out there, is to help students understand you have abilities. We just maybe need to find different ways to talk about them. And that's some of what Jack was doing on the wheel, but helping them understand that, yes, you have ways of understanding and ways of doing research. We can call it research because you have ways of understanding. And so helping students really translate those skills when they keep just bumping into things and saying, I don't get it. I don't get why the ways that I know of the world, because I've been ingrained in me and taught, just keep bumping into dominant culture and they're not working for me. And it's like, okay, let's help them work for you instead of you just saying, this isn't working, I quit. And helping them really turn, skills and abilities that are just ingrained into skills and abilities they can use throughout, what a dominant culture sort of job search or, job process. So those are some of the things that I've really tried to work on, and they're completely possible. It's just helping them and helping, maybe a dominant culture workplace understand what those skills are. And so that's some of the things that I've tried to work with.
And I think that those are very, very valid points, Tamison. And I think they segue very seamlessly into one of our next talking points, and I will pose this to Angel first to lead us off into this, is, what have you found to be some of the most successful means by which employers have been able to engage students like yourself, as well as some of your fellow students?
Well, I think that, I'll start off with thinking a little bit of some of the partnerships that we've had over time. The relationship, as I've shared a document and to be shared out with the attendees today, but I think that, at the primary, core of it is basically sort of thinking about what is the relationship, like what is the purpose and what is the intent and what is the overall outcome. And if you can let yourself sort of sink deeper into that question to understand, like, why do you want Native students or Native people to work for your organization? That becomes a really primary, focus. I did a presentation for North Carolina school system a few years ago, and that was one of the main questions I asked them was like, why do you want to recruit Native students? And to that, like, why do you want to create an American Indian Studies program that seems to be doing well at Pembroke at all of your schools? Like, you all have very centered, focuses of study. Like, why not, NC State think about like how agricultural seems to work and what sort of topics seem to be most relevant to tribal communities, and then dig deeper into sort of creating curriculum that does that. And that seemed to be a foreign concept to them. And so, the thing that I think is always trying to let go of what you think the process is looking like now to get to the thing of like, how do I want to build this relationship? AT&T is a great partner with the College Fund, but they started off with just offering scholarships. And that came to the point of like, how do we understand the student at that level and then support students to become, in quotes, more confident to, link, as Tamison said, to that cultural identity structure to get into a job at AT&T. More than, 15, 16 years, we're now getting to the point of like, hey, we actually can get one student to actually intern for you. And so, but it's like, how do you invest in that relationship over the long term? Because most of the solutions, when you're working with another, identity structure and another cultural group, like, you have to build some of that give and take, the ebb and flow, understand a little bit more and get deeper into it, because it's not just about a job. I had another conversation with Intuit yesterday where, the work that they have been doing is trying to understand, why do people use our tools or not use our tools? And they shared an example as we were thinking about the whole way that they focus in on building their tools to get to the whole point of taxes, to get to the whole point of job searching. And, at the end of that conversation, I was laughing and I said, well, I wonder if there's a question here that represents this idea and the framework around money. And if that's what is sort of incurring students to not, be as invested in finding the right job, because they seem to have a different value structure. They want to be thousandaires versus billionaires, and they want to be able to provide for their family in a specific way versus having to sort of invigorate the idea that I need a house for myself, I need a new car for me. So it's like being able to sort of understand some of those nuances to know that the things that you're throwing at them may not work because they have a completely different value structure. So you need to dig deeper into that just to know a little bit more.
And I think that's a point, Jack. As an employer, it's very easy to look at things very short-sighted and say, why aren't we hitting certain recruiting numbers? Why aren't certain students applying to our programs? And, this is something that, we're very fortunate enough to be able to discuss within our affinity group with here at NACE. However, I think it's educating our fellow employers, and then conversely also, looking at it from different perspectives. It's not just on the employer, it's on the students, it's on the schools as well. But really, from an employer perspective, it's looking at it and saying, how do we address these issues? How do we really interact and approach students so that we can learn as an employer what's working and what's not? Tamison made a great point earlier about transition, about adaptability. Well, it's a two-way street as well. From an employer perspective, if you're recruiting at a school for 5 years and the numbers are steady, you haven't seen much growth or much dip in interest, the logical next step into seeing, what can we do to further that is to take a step back and learn from the students, learn from the schools, and really take that approach rather than looking at it from the employer view as why are we failing as a corporation? It should be more saying, why are we not looking at the process to see what needs to be fixed? And I think, Angel, being a student, it would be great to get your feedback on that to see, what are things that employers have done that have been positive engagement? And then alternatively, what hasn't worked as far as engagement from the employer side? Because, I think if anything, the purpose of this panel is really to educate us and learn something new today. So really, it would be great to get your feedback, Angel.
Sure. What I'd like to share is when we go to college, we're thinking of our relatives, we're thinking of our community, we're thinking of taking care of the generations yet to come, and looking out for the generations before us. So with that in mind, how are you going to help us provide for our relatives and build a stronger community, in tribal nations, whether that's, and we specifically look to go to a tribal college because that's the focus, and that's the understanding. So I think that I would just like to leave you with that, and also something to think about is relationships are important. Conversations are important, they're impactful. How are you helping Indigenous students in middle school, in high school? What relationships are you building there? Where, internships are powerful. When we come from tribal nations, it can be a culture shock stepping into society as far as like a large urban community goes. What are you doing to help that transition? How are they familiarizing themselves with you? How are you familiarizing yourself with them? Again, yeah, it's just a completely different value system. And it's really important to understand that that's our connectedness. Our connectedness is to our people and it's to our communities. And keeping that in mind and knowing that, that's going to help build bridges immensely. I think that's all that I can provide to that question.
I mean, I think that's a great point. I think building bridges, is something that we need to take back and really assess how we're doing that. The fact that, you're referencing loyalty, you're referencing the ability to really, the family aspect of it. As an employer view, it's important that we take that and really look to internally in our organizations to see what are we doing to support the tribal students from high school, like you said, and then onwards. Employee resource groups are immensely important because they helped with that transition from going from the reservation to an urban environment. They give you that ability to connect with somebody that's gone through that. I would love to get Tamison's view on this, just because, I think that I've had conversations with her about, what we can do as an employer, what further can we do? So I think she has some great insights she could share at this point.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have traveled a little bit in my past, because I started, my tribe is in Oklahoma, grew up in Kansas, went to Michigan, now I'm in Minnesota. So I have traveled and left where I came from. And I know that for me, I didn't think probably that, just go from here to there. But it was very different, and it was very hard to go from what I knew in the Midwest, and I know everybody here would say it's the Midwest, but it was very hard to go from a Plains Indian culture that the Osage are, to being in Michigan that is a woodlands culture. And it wasn't mine. It wasn't where I fit. And they don't dress the same. They don't have the same cultural values. It's not the same. And it was very difficult for me. And, there's funny stories, like little funny stories of how much I didn't fit, and how, I would have panic attacks over just little things like wearing my shawl, or, just little things that my friends would just be like, you're nuts, like, just calm down. I'm like, no, I'm having panic attacks over these little things. Right. But I found my place and I found my family and I found my fit, and they became very, very important to me and helped me through, very personal things in my life. And I missed them a lot. And now I'm somewhere else, and now I'm going to have to find that same family and that same fit again. But it isn't something that maybe you would understand if you weren't connected to the community. You might not understand that it's not all the same. Like, just because you use the term Native American doesn't mean that all cultures are the same. And if you were coming from the Northwest and you were trying to come into, a woodlands or a plains, like, it's not the same. And so really trying to support a new student coming out of college that did something like Angel did and left her community. Like, that just doesn't mean that she can just go find a community anywhere and that it's going to fit for her. That's something that she would really have to think long and hard about, leaving, her community where she is and going to, Arizona. Like, she would probably be like, what the heck is going on down here? So, that would be a big jump for her and something she would really have to think about. And then what would it mean to travel back to support her family and monetarily? And so those are big decisions that, an Indigenous student makes and has to think about. And how do you, as an employer, either factor that into the process to make sure that those types of supports are available, or that you're thinking about that? I know that when I moved, the first place I was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I relied on, there was a Native American museum, and I made a lot of connections there. And that's not always possible, but that's where I made mine. But that's a big thought. That's something that may not be in awareness for a lot of people, that those are big concerns and big thoughts. And like Angel was saying, our big concern is, how am I going to use this opportunity to support those around me, those I love? How am I going to give back to them? Because many times they've given to me, they've made this opportunity possible. Without them, I wouldn't be where I am. And so how am I going to give back to them, to support them, to make sure that those coming behind me can get where I am? And it isn't about me, it's about them. And so, and even maybe I don't have anyone coming behind me, but then how do I make sure that those coming behind me, in terms of maybe in my profession or in my discipline or whatever, have that opportunity? Like, make sure that I'm connected. If I'm not connected to you, if I'm not connected to something, this isn't where I want to be. So I think that really understanding that and taking the time to understand that, time for us is not about the watch and the clock. It's about the relationship. And that, you gotta get that. You gotta understand that.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head, Tamison. Relationships, they're a two-way street. There's a lot of work that goes into building successful relationships, not just with students and universities, but through employers as well. And I think that as an employer, it's important that we take the time to recognize that while, in the short term, yes, the goal is to offer jobs. How are we going about offering the jobs? How are we making sure that the students and the universities know that they can trust you as an organization, that they know that you do have the students' best interests in mind, that you're willing to take that extra step to support the universities? I think that that's something that's food for thought, and I think that there's no immediate fix. It's more of a long-standing conversation that needs to happen so that we can begin to ingrain these types of processes when building relationships. So it's not just limited to, hey, we need to fill some requirements. It's how can we support the organization and the student from the beginning of their journey through the end of their professional career. Jack, I think one of the conversations we had not too long ago was around this topic in particular. I mean, is there an example that you can share with us and everybody else? I mean, I think that one of the benefits that we have is having resources available to us, such through NACE, where we're able to leverage contact information, but more importantly, we're able to leverage feedback from individuals like yourself, like Angel, like Tamison, and these type of events. So please, if you could share any sort of feedback on that last topic.
Yeah, I have two examples that I want to pull out. One was, again, with our great partnership with AT&T. When we were thinking about, when we were launching this sort of career initiative to sort of dig deeper into the conversation, my pushback has always been that, your hiring process is a little difficult. And, at that point, it was just sort of an access type of thinking, like, are they prepared to interview 35 times before they create a video where someone gets to view it, and then they go back to an assessment team, and then they come back and they offer them a second interview, and then they're invited for another interview, and then they go in and then they're selected for, another interview to, then sort of be, thought of for an internship. And and then sort of just thinking about the vetting process seems to be pretty like intense, and does it need to be all the time? And so when we were having this conversation with AT&T, I was pushing back and saying, like, I'm not really sure that the way that you're testing our students is going to be of value. So can I see the example? And they gave me they didn't show me the test, but they told me what they were looking at. And so I told them, like, I don't necessarily think that our students are going to test well within this framework. So just so you know. And so they created a side process to sort of work with our students specifically. That's one outcome that happened. But the biggest win was that they went back and they reviewed the outcomes of that testing mechanism for all of their students. And for students of color, it didn't translate into the variable and the metric that they were hoping, because they were saying that these students specifically within this type of output are moving into positions here at AT&T, and they realized that that was not true. And that was after 5 years of data. So this was 5 years of process that they're looking at, thinking that it was working to onboard students and into employees, but it wasn't. So it's sort of being able to be flexible enough to sort of review what your outcome is so that you can look at what the input output sort of ratio seems to be, and understand what metrics really need to look like. And then the other example, there's a question about values and sort of thinking about, and to your point, Luis, that it's not an easy process to say, like, this is going to work because these 5 things about the Native community. So working with Amazon, they have some substantial, pretty stellar like values. And when we were trying to build a relationship, which didn't come to fruition in the way that we wanted to, so we ended. But the thing was, is they had 3 strong values. I'm like, if you could tout how you are supporting a community, Native community specifically, I'm sure that they would be interested to have a conversation with you about like wanting to partner. One facet. The second is, if you can highlight these 3 values in reference to your outreach to Native people, they would be curious. So you have values within your corporations and your company already that align with some of this work. Any organization or company that has the foundation has a sense of altruism. Lean into that. Any company that has a sense of and the responsibility is to start or allow for an affinity group to start, lean into that. Because it's not just those marker points, but it's like there's something that's happening in the way that you are allowing these conversations to come to fruition. So realize that you have the answer already in your systems. You just need to acknowledge them, that they're actually solution sets that are working. So, just sort of don't feel like there's a magic answer out there, because it's not magic. It's basically like what we just said, relationships are important. So when you are building a relationship, what do? You say hello, you walk up, you learn customs, you learn how to say things to them appropriately, you learn how to invite them in to eat with you. Eating for tribes is, unfortunate or not, very important. Food is always a good way of sort of building that relationship. Figure out like how you can provide in those very what we'll call necessities to build some of this invigorate curiosity. Because it's not about the win is employment, the win is curiosity. And as you lean into that, that becomes the building block to sort of knowing what the long-term objective becomes.
That was very well said, Jack. And I think, it goes without being said that a really good first step in creating these relationships and creating understanding is attending events like today's panel. Already in the brief 20 minutes that we've been on, I've already taken away quite a few different things. I think that it's very insightful to hear these things from my perspective. It would be great to understand more from your side, Tamison. What have been examples of successful ways that employers have engaged with students? Or at least, I'll rephrase that, what would you suggest would be some better ways for employers to engage with students?
Yeah, and I hate to be like, okay, here's some little teeny tiny things, but I think about like my former university was a big 10 university, I won't go more specific than that, but I worked with our elder board and we worked on powwows and events, and and I think about the few times that we could reach out to an employer and say, hey, we're always looking for sponsors to, we have a coffee booth, right? That the money that we make on that, we put into our scholarships and we put into our things that we give to graduating seniors, right? And we're always looking for people to blah, blah, blah. And an employer that would have said, great, what do you need? How many students we would have had a huge banner for them, and how many students would have seen that, and our students that were working their tails off to make the powwow go, little things like that again, that's getting into our community, and our community was incredibly involved in the powwow, and how many students would have seen that and would have been involved in that and would have seen that. So there are, on these campuses, there are groups that are involved in the community, and they reach into the community, not just into the campus community, but into the larger community as well, that support these students. And so if, find ways, and again, it's about relationships. It's not about pushing. It's not about pushing who you are and what you want. It's about, how do I help? It's the same thing. If you go back to Jack's wheel, it's not about pushing you. It's about pushing, what does the community need? And you're going to get what you need from giving what they need. That's how it works. But how do you take that simple thing, and then what do they need, and then figure out how you get what you need from giving what they need. And it's about time, and it's about building relationships with time. And that may not be a million little simple suggestions, but that's kind of a broad-based solution.
No, that's very, very useful. And I noticed that there seems to be a lot of activity in the chat box with questions. So we'll definitely circle back to the questions in a few minutes after we finish our presentation. From your view, Angel, and without naming any names, what has been, I guess, one of the more successful ways that an employer has, that you've at least encountered, has engaged with yourself and your fellow students?
Sure. So I happen to be a student representative on the Student Government Association, and oftentimes we have companies, individuals coming to our SGA meetings to present ideas, to see how they can be helpful to our success. Sometimes they're having things happening in the community that they kind of reach out to us and invite us. We just had a round dance. Well, before COVID hit, we had a very successful round dance where there was, wonderful sponsorship from entities all throughout the community. And just like, Tamison mentioned, they were highlighted throughout that round dance, and are now working with other entities in the college to see how to build that relationship. So I think that would be, for me, what I've seen, probably the most impactful.
And I think that's a good example right there of building a relationship. It's not just limited to, hey, we want to recruit your students. It's what are we doing in addition to that by getting involved within these student organizations. I think it's a key thing to take away, because, if you really are looking to build a long-term partnership, it means that that's a long-term relationship. And ultimately, the feedback that you just shared, Angel, is there's no better proof than that. By getting involved in these student organizations early on, you will build these relationships, not just with the school, but with the students as well. You build that referenceability, you build that trust. If you're active in these events, it's a lot easier for you to then turn around and say, look, we're looking to hire. How can we already have this in place? How can we further support you as an applicant? It's interesting, Jack, going back to one of the earlier points and going back to your wheel, and, we can sit here and say, these are best practices, but I think the best way to do that is to actually initiate them. And it starts with a conversation. If you start to have these conversations with the different schools, with the different career development offices, you will get the feedback directly from the students, because they are the lifeline to you as an employer. I mean, from your view, Jack, do you think that there's anything further that employers should be doing, or that you can suggest to any of the employers that are listening today?
I have a few things that I think probably should be pulled out. The thing is that, the American Indian College Fund, we are here to help build some of those partnerships and relationships. So you can reach out to me, and I don't know if we're going to have that opportunity to share our connections in the future. But, you know, we work with the tribal colleges and universities, and, you know, Angel is an attendee at the United Tribes Technical College, and Tamison also went to a TCU as well. But, you know, it's when you're thinking about these institutions, you know, they're in relationship building, it's hard to sort of express why, but they like to have visitors come to their campus and do something. And it's not necessarily based upon the idea that you have to like be recruiters. Like if you like even just like attend a powwow and, you know, and just sort of figure out like, how do I understand this community a little better, you know, and then try to, you know, connect with the tribe just to sort of, you know, be able to translate what the experience of like growth looks like for that community, barriers and challenges, you know, because that's a part of the I think that the core, maybe even just the seed, is if you can understand what community development means for these spaces, then you're going to be able to sort of figure out like how you are problem solving these challenges. I'm going to say this: broadband is a huge issue for everybody in the United States, more so for people in rural spaces. Solve that problem, build a relationship with the tribe, and build a relationship with the tribal college university to find a solution. There's one way that you can figure out, no, if you work to just do that, and you bring people in from those communities to help you problem solve that, like you're going to build a natural pipeline for people to be curious and also to be employees. So think into things that you think are going to be relevant to outcomes that are not just about numbers, you know, because the thing, and I'm glad that Angel, you know, she snapped at that, because broadband is an issue. All of you at company levels have some sort of capacity to figure this out. So supply dollars, sponsorships, however you want to quantify it, to do some of the hard work, which is basically just going into the community and saying, we're tired of you not having broadband, so we're going to sink in $1 million for you to figure it out. Like, so now where do we start? Do you need faculty? Do you need staff? Do you need scholarships? What else, you know, curriculum do we have to build or construct, or what other curriculum is out there, so we can start partnering and bringing them in to sort of problem solve. So the thing is that if you take that type of tactic, man, it would be amazing. It would be super cool. I'm just going to use that word, because that doesn't seem to be where we're at in reference to thinking about how education and employment and all of this comes together in reference to the idea of stewardship, kindness, you know, cooperation and collaboration, because we keep putting each other's in these stereotypical sort of, you know, DIE boxes that we're trying to tick off the number section, as opposed to really sort of problem solve what the thing is that you're here to be helpful to people. So how do we learn how to be helpful? And that's been the conversation I've had with Intuit. You know, I got them to sponsor 6 interns to do some assessment on why financial literacy education resources are not making sense to the tribal members in the Pacific Northwest around their schools. Like, how cool is that? You know, and that's amazing. And now it's like it's pulling into it in a larger scale to think about, well, we've never thought about that before, because we just thought everybody in America was the same, which is not true. And so I'm, you know, now I'm getting pretty energized. So I'm going to have to cut myself off, because this is a great topic for me. And I'm so glad that I got an opportunity to share. So thank you.
No, absolutely. I think that your point is very much, you know, spot on. I think that it's understanding and learning that these hurdles exist. You know, it's such a mind-blowing concept to take a step back and actually educate yourself. You know, I've had several conversations with Tamison within our affinity group here at NACE, and every time I walk out of that conversation, I take something back with myself that I reflect upon, and I just really make an effort to learn about it. You know, as I go back and have my internal conversations within M3, one of the things that I like to do is reference the conversations that we've had, because again, it's just a different mindset when looking at, you know, why are we falling short? Well, if the reason we're falling short is because individual students aren't able to access our webinars, aren't able to access our virtual interviews, and it's only because they just lack the fundamental something that we take for granted, such as Wi-Fi connectivity or any sort of internet connectivity. Well, it's no issue for it's not because the students are deficient. It's not because the students don't want the jobs. It's because there exists a hurdle there. And it's our job as employers to work with the universities, work with the schools, work with partners such as yourself, Jack, to identify what we can do. As you said, you know, how can we collectively make a change, whether that means sponsoring broadband, whether that means going on the campuses and participating in events in person. You know, it'd be great to get some feedback from you, Tamsin, before we go into the QA session, as far as, you know, what resources are available for employers like myself to look into, to see how can we partner with university, how can we build these partnerships, and really how can we help overcome some of these hurdles?
Yeah, I always like to say, come talk to someone in the career center. Obviously, that's the first connection, but almost most universities will have some type of office that has some type of connection into the community, and then there, if they don't, then hopefully that will spur them to make that better connection. The best partnerships and programs that I have seen are when there is that great synergy between the employer, at St. Cloud State, it's the American Indian Center. In my former university, it was a different office, but when we were able to bring all three together so that you had experts in every way working together. So those are always great. I would never say to an employer, don't do something, because no, I want them to get in there and do whatever they can and get any connections. But when you're able to bring everyone together so that when an employer goes and makes a connection, and then a student also knows to come to the Career Center so that they're getting their resume reviewed and they're getting the best foot out there. That's always the best way. So that anytime you've got all three working together as a synergy, that's great. Sometimes too, if an employer doesn't know who to go to on a campus, then they're just lost. But if they come to someone like me who does know who to send them to and can make that connection, that's great. So, I think sometimes if an employer has like one person to connect to, and then they can send them where they need to go, that works, can make that introduction, can get things going. So I always like having that one place to make a connection to that can help them get connected. So, so that's usually what I like. I like any way we can get synergies where a student gets everything they need connected together.
Very, very useful. And again, every time we chat, Tamsin, I always take back something that I learned from our conversations. And I think that on that, we're doing really well on time. I think it would be a great opportunity now to really dive in and get some of the feedback from the participants that are watching us right now and really answer some of the questions. As I was scrolling through, one of the first ones that jumped out as we are in the midst of this conversation, I'll open this up to Tamsin first, but again, it would be great to get your feedback, Jack, as well as Angel. But aside from what we've already discussed, what are some kind of the policies employers might need to adopt that would better support and align with the values of Native students and professionals? That was one of the questions that came through.
I don't know. I'm gonna let Jack start that one. I think he's been working more with that, and he's got some good ideas. I want Jack to start with that one. Let me think about that one.
So can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sure, absolutely. It was really around what type of policy should employers adopt that would better support and align with the value of the students and professionals?
Well, I think that, again, I'm going to reiterate, reciprocity seems to be a very key component. So we've iterated in a variety of different ways. So understanding what the community needs and wants are. So we're looking at the needs of students as sort of the core to that, and that's the beginning of the conversation. But sometimes the students don't necessarily know, well, I'm going to say it this way. We know in higher ed that students are not always very aware of how talented or the knowledge that they have inside of them about how to, in quotes, problem solve or think about solution sets. So it's trying to figure out how do you build a better, responsibility around trying to get to the core issues, in quotes, and challenges of the community. So in the idea of reciprocity and stewardship, there's also sort of the responsibility of sort of community development and learning what that sort of seems like. I stated broadband. What does that mean? What does it mean for your company? What does it mean for the people that are in this community, in this area? So you can begin to think about it in terms of that. So centralizing from a larger issue and then sort of digging deeper to know how does this sort of fit within this environment? Every one of us have, and even all of you know that broadband is a huge issue for students anywhere, even in cities. So like, what is the thing that needs to be solved in that? And that's where you bring in the student. You know, they can tell you, they may have ideas, they may not, but it's just sort of understanding that the question you're asking is big. And so to ask the, like, how do you change your culture might be another thing to be reflective of. You know, again, I'm working, with a group of people to develop some, policy around building a foundation to provide more funding for access to the outdoors. But the way that we, the challenge that we're having is that the outdoor and outdoor recreation is built upon the construct of rich white America. And I'm like, why are we giving money to people of color who have far richer experiences beyond skiing, in Aspen? And trying to figure out, like, what is this dialogue that we're having in our own communities, and offering dollars to be supportive to that, along with allowing them to go and ski in Aspen. So it's not like we're trying to eliminate one, but we're trying to figure out, like, there's a framework, fine, but what are the people in the community, or the people that we're not sort of addressing in this framework? Or is there anything that we're missing? Because when we began to have that conversation, the people of color, we only have people of color in that group that I'm working with. Like, it was a challenge to get to the new space, because we were so ingrained with the idea that we just want to give people of color, youth of color, dollars to go and ski in Aspen. And I was like, that doesn't sound like right to me. So let's talk about it. So there's a conversation and a willingness to sort of provide information, provide, the capacity to share your thoughts and your ideas, and then also work at sort of understanding what collaborative language looks like. And that's a language that you're going to have to build, because it's not about, we're going to take the things that we know about collaboration and shove them into this relationship. Like, there's a give and take. And sometimes, the models don't work for different tribes, for different people. Corporations don't want to move in a specific way, and that's fine. We're not saying, like, change your, like, trajectory, but just figure out, like, how you do your work in a way that can make sense to the community that you want to connect with. And if you can't, then own it, and then leave the Native American people alone. Because that is another hard part of this, is that if your company does not want to align and work with natives in the way that they want to work, then maybe that's not what you do. So being able to, adjust to a certain point and know that you have the luxury of just not pursuing it is also an outcome. Just as we work with students and work with employees, this company may not be your place, and this trajectory may not be your trajectory. We have to figure out, like, how to deal with that loss and that breakup. So companies also have to sort of own that. DEI is just a nice little slice of butter on a, hot piece of toast. But when you get down to the bare bones of it, there's work in there, and there's a lot of work. And the company needs to own its responsibility in that work, because it's just asking people, we're offering you a great opportunity to do something, but we're not going to tell you what we're doing, and we're not going to show you how to do it so that you can be useful to your company. One thing that I did change in the language of trying to get students to be curious about things is, like, if you're problem solving for water and you're a Native person who is, water means something to you, like, you should go and, like, study water, in the Gulf of Mexico or in the Great Lakes regions, if they're from a different property, so they can go back and bring back the knowledge that they want to sort of use to procure a future wellness, healthy, future based upon the knowledge that they can bring back. So how does the company sort of take that charge too? And again, if it's something you don't want to do or you can't do, then maybe you need to sort of let this go and move on to something else, because it's taxing, as you've heard so many oftentimes in DEI work. It's taxing for us to sort of tell you, like, what it is that you want to hear when you don't want to hear what we're telling you. And that's a huge part of this dialogue, I think.
I also think that employers need to be more attentive to just simple things like the images that they are projecting. Very rarely do Native students see themselves. They don't see themselves in social media. They don't see themselves on websites. They don't, right now, You know, a lot of companies are talking about, well, we support this type of business or this type of business, but I don't really see a lot of companies saying we support Native-owned businesses, you know? So if I'm a Native student and I'm thinking about, do I take a chance on your company, and I don't see myself represented, I don't see you wanting to take a chance on my community, I wonder, why would you take a chance on me?
Sure.
Because I don't see me represented.
And that's a conversation that continues to be had across all groups, you know, and I think that it's also important to look and see, you know, and I'm going to leverage Tamison and Jack's feedback on this. What have employers done that have, or in organizations done that have successfully made you both feel included or supportive within their organizations?
Well, I mean, it just depends. You know, if it's a Native organization, I can sort of tell you that, you know, there's a responsibility that sort of seems inherent to make me feel, you know, comfortable and accepted. But if you're talking about a non-Native, you know, business or entity, you know, I'm going to say that there are some dumb things that I really like. Like, you know, someone asked in here, what are some of the things that you need to consider? Like holiday, like Indigenous Peoples Day, giving Natives that day off. Like, wow, that's huge. You know, understanding a little bit more about like how this company sits on the property of a former tribe, and then trying to figure out like how do we invigorate that history, or just sort of acknowledging that they are on property. You know, that's another part of this public land stuff that I'm doing now, and trying to turn the language to, you know, tribally recognized traditional lands. You know, and in something that we do in our company, which I think is super cool, like we get our birthday off paid. And it's just like, they're just little like nuanced things about, you're trying to problem solve the diversity issue by looking at the cultural aspect. But sometimes if you just make a person feel important enough without having to dig deeper into that relationship, and like, you know, I need you to tell me about all the Indianness of Indian so I can be helpful to the Indianness of you. Sometimes that's not the issue or the problem. Sometimes it's just like, hey, you are a valued employee here and you're doing something really great. Like, how do I highlight you so that, you know, we can sort of understand like what this means? And then they'll sort of provide a little bit more information about like, this is going to work in this way for me. And I don't want to be touted in this way, and I don't want to be showed up in this way. I don't want my picture here, but I'll be happy to sort of hold a conversation with people to tell them a little bit more about like who I am and what my trajectory is, and sort of just being responsive to some of that way of just sort of providing that outlet for them. Oh, another thing I was going to say is that, you know, for some reason, ceremonies and I hate to say it, but death is like, it's rampant in our communities. And if you can allow for policies that allow for people to leave, you know, we're understanding remote work enough now. Like, how does remote work tie into some of the responsibility of, you know, I want to be of service to my employees. So if they want to go home for ceremony, if they want to go home for a death, which is the third one in the past month, because that happens, and build those policy structures that allow for them to do that, and some of the things that they're learning through this pandemic and through remote work, that's going to be pretty solid. Because again, you're listening to a need that I have and the way that I'm showing up in the world and the connection to my community, but I also want to learn how to be of service. And if you allow for me to take on something that is not hard to do, in quotes, and move that to a policy structure where the employee gets to sort of be flexible in that and learn and grow, like, you're going to win people, not just natives, but people in general. So I think that's another thing that I think is pretty valuable.
That was very, very powerful. It'd be interesting also to kind of piggyback off of that, Jack, and really understand from an employer view and supporting employees that we do hire. What's one way during the digital world is, you know, with everything gone virtual right now, what are some ways to celebrate the culture that you would suggest or that you've seen to be successful? And this question is open to everybody on the panel right now, as obviously this is just information that we can all feed back, not just internally, but across our organizations after this call. So it'd be good to understand in this virtual environment, what are some successful ways to celebrate the heritage? Because ultimately the goal is to help make our students that do apply and join our organization feel included, no matter what their background is.
I'm going to provide some answer, but I'm going to look to Angel to sort of add some depth, because I think she probably has a pretty a good insight from where she's at. And she's mentioned some things that I wanted to say she was going to reiterate. But I think that, you know, we talk about this idea of just sort of like thinking about that cultural construct. How do we get around the idea that this is just about dancing and beating and feathers and those aspects? It's hard because you're going to have to sort of readdress the content that you're looking for. You know, I've been invited to speak at events during Native American Heritage Month, which is fine because it's offered up for that space. But like, how do you incorporate, you know, community endeavor and development and collaboration and efforts outside of November? Because November is such a weird month for me. You know, I'm celebrating something that I don't necessarily buy into, but, you know, try to figure out like, how do you incorporate that framework of Indigenous Peoples Day? And that's another part of this too, is, you know, it doesn't necessarily with virtual spaces. I think there's a better capacity to connect to people because Indians are just as Native Americans, American Indians, Indigenous people are just as busy as you are. So we would probably prefer a virtual setting just so we can have access to sort of doing some of this work. And then, you know, try to figure out like, how do you invigorate that connection between the value structure of your company into the speaking engagement so that one can speak to the value of the company itself so people can understand and learn how to reiterate or develop definition around things that they already believe in, you know? And I think that that's probably, you know, those are some of those high level ones. And I'll look to Angel to sort of be more pragmatic about it.
And I'll ask Temeston to go next as I continue to gather my thoughts on that.
I think one of the best things, and it was just really simple, but one of the best things we did here just after graduation was able to gather the students and an elder and, you know, just be able to share. Again, just to be able to share community and to give thanks for the fact that we had students who graduated, who had jobs, who had succeeded, but be able to share those with, you know, with an elder and with the drum and with song, but be able to share that with family and with all those things that mean something to us. But we did it virtually, and that's okay. But, you know, those kinds of things can still happen. We just had to find different ways of doing them. But yeah, I mean, it still happens. We just have to be creative about them. But the core of who we are doesn't change, just the method of how we're doing it.
In Angel, I can offer up something that I think is pretty valuable. You know, working with United Tribes Technical College, they have a criminal justice program, and they were always looking for speakers. So, like, how do you offer up your capacity as an employer to sort of be supportive to some of the, you know, the majors? And they have websites, and you can, you know, go in and look at what they offer in reference to coursework, and then maybe reach out to some of the faculty and say, like, hey, I have an interest in sort of presenting about our company to your class. Can I do that? You know, that's one little small thing that I think is really helpful.
And some tribes actually have some, I know that mine has a lot of their history on there, a lot of their museums on. So there's actually some really good stuff out there if you go digging.
Yeah, I will just shortly, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say right after you, there was one last question before we wrap up, so I'll pass it off to you.
Sure. I was going to just say community also, you know, again, it's huge for us. We are very connected people. And so having to adjust from that connectedness to take those community spaces virtual has been a challenge and something that we're working on. I'm sure as everyone else is. But yes, like oftentimes we're spinning our wheels. How can we provide this virtual space? What can we do? And thank you for bringing that up, Jack. Absolutely, we were just discussing what kind of virtual spaces can we create, webinars, you know, what can we do? So I think that would probably be the most impactful. How can we continue to educate? How can we continue to share space and celebrate one another? All of these things are very important.
Well, I wanted to thank you all for all of this insight. You know, I think that if anything, it goes back to the point earlier, this was an educational tool and an opportunity to really learn. One last question, which should be a pretty short one, but I did want to address it just because it did come up in the chat box before we close out, was around preferred language. Specifically, one of the questions was, what is preferred? Is it Native American, Indigenous people, American Indian, from your perspectives? And this is your opportunity to kind of wrap up for the day. So I'll let you guys go in any order before I pass it back over to NACE.
I just typed a response, and the thing is that it's always a difficult question, because I'm sure that Tamison can attest, in academia, man, we are about nomenclature. So the thing is that as you begin to build a relationship with the tribe or the community around you, it's I don't think that's an appropriate question to ask them, do they prefer that? But I would probably just sort of think into the identity structure based upon their community membership, their tribal membership. I didn't mention it, but I'm Navajo and Kokopah. So instead of like saying, do I prefer X, Y, and Z? If you're not writing an Indigenous or an educational paper, nomenclature is probably going to be better suited to sort of understand, like, how do you want to build this relationship? What's your understanding? So feel comfortable in your knowledge to sort of open up the dialogue about like who you think we want to be referred to. And there was another question about like thinking into the acknowledgement. It's powerful if you're meeting with people from that area. If you are doing it just to sort of do it for namesake, it becomes a thing that you're just sort of like doing. And it's not necessarily useful, because when, Angel and I, not to say Tamison wasn't thinking it either, but, we invoked like the spirit of the people that we're part of. We asked them to be part of this conversation. So as you begin to think about land acknowledgement, that's the purpose. It's not just to tell people like, oh, you need to remember that Indians lived here once. It's about, oh, there's traditional knowledge, and there's experts, living in a realm that I'm not a part of, and there are things that are happening in this space that may be universal enough that I can just sort of acknowledge and saying like, it can lead and guide us to this conversation, so that it brings in a spirit that is beyond this idea that, America has taken over the identity of natives. A lot of the things that we work with is that America has really sort of destroyed the language that we can really express what we're trying to say without sounding, poignant or pointed. And so that becomes the hard part too. So I'll stop there.
And I think that, that's a good point to stop for today. It creates a good dynamic where the conversation can continue. It has been an absolute pleasure listening to you all share all these insights with us. At this point, we will now turn it back over to NACE to close out the session. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for your guidance, Louis. You're fantastic.
Yes.
We would like to thank Louis Amaro, Tamison Smith, Angel Moniz, Jack Soto, and Chris Carlson as chat manager for a very informative session. And thank you, participants, for attending today's webinar. The archive, along with step-by-step instructions on how to receive these items, will be made available within 3 to 5 business days. Please note that the PowerPoint presentation will be made available following today's webinar. We would like to thank you for attending today's session. This officially concludes the webinar, and you may now sign off.